Most senior men are not afraid of being alone. They're afraid of losing themselves again. And that is a truth most people never stop long enough to understand. Because from the outside, it looks like withdrawal, like distance, like a man becoming cold or difficult with age. But inside, something very different is happening. A man like Robert Hayes didn't wake up one morning and decide he no longer wanted connection. He simply reached a point where connection that came at the cost of his inner peace no longer felt worth it. For decades, he did what was expected of him. He showed up, he stayed quiet when it was easier, he adjusted his tone, his reactions, even his silence to keep things steady, to keep people comfortable, to keep the relationship intact. And for a long time, that felt like strength. It felt like responsibility. It felt like what a good man does. But somewhere along the way, without any dramatic moment or obvious breaking point, he started to notice something he couldn't ignore anymore. That every time he chose harmony over honesty, he was slowly disconnecting from himself. Not all at once, not in a way anyone else could see, but in small, quiet ways that added up over the years. And by the time he reached his 60s, that quiet loss became impossible to tolerate because at this stage of life, a man begins to understand something with absolute clarity, that whatever time he has left is too valuable to spend pretending to be someone he no longer recognizes. When Robert Hayes was in his 30s, he believed something most men believe without ever questioning it, that if you give enough, stay patient enough, and keep things together no matter what, everything will eventually work out. Back then, emotional discomfort felt like a temporary phase, something you push through, something you tolerate for the sake of stability, family, and the future you were trying to build. He did not see it as losing himself. He saw it as being a man. He adjusted his words and conversations, softened his opinions when tension started rising, and learned how to read the room before he ever expressed what he actually felt. It became second nature, almost automatic, like driving the same road every day without thinking about the turns. And for years, it worked, at least on the surface. The house stayed calm, the arguments stayed manageable, and the relationship with Susan Miller looked solid to anyone standing on the outside. But what no one saw was how every small adjustment came with a quiet cost. How every time he chose to keep the peace, he gave up a piece of honesty that never quite came back. At 35, that trade felt reasonable, even necessary. At 45, it started to feel heavier, like something he carried without knowing how to put down. And by the time he crossed into his 60s, the math had changed completely, because what once felt like sacrifice for something meaningful now felt like a pattern he could finally see clearly, a pattern where he had been slowly negotiating away his own emotional freedom one moment at a time. What Robert began to understand, slowly at first, and then all at once, was that the real damage was never in the big moments. It was in the accumulation of the small ones he dismissed for years. It was in the conversations where he held back what he really thought because it would take too long to explain, in the evenings where he felt drained but still stayed engaged out of obligation, in the subtle tension of always measuring his words before speaking them. None of it looked serious on its own, nothing that would alarm anyone from the outside, but together it created a quiet form of emotional fatigue that never fully went away. And the most dangerous part was how normal it felt, how easy it was to convince himself that this was just what relationships required. But as he moved deeper into his 60s, something shifted inside him that he could no longer ignore. His tolerance for that kind of internal negotiation started to disappear. The same situations he once managed without thinking now felt heavy, unnecessary, almost suffocating in a way he had never allowed himself to admit before. He began to notice how quickly his energy dropped after certain interactions, how even simple conversations could leave him feeling disconnected from himself. It was not anger, and it was not resentment. It was clarity, the kind that comes after years of experience finally start lining up into a pattern you can no longer unsee. And once he saw it clearly, once he recognized that he had been trading pieces of his emotional freedom for the illusion of stability, the idea of continuing that pattern became something he simply could not accept anymore. By the time Robert reached this stage of life, he began to understand something that younger men rarely grasp in time, that emotional energy is not unlimited, and more importantly, it is not renewable in the way they once believed. In his 30s and 40s, he could recover quickly from tension, from misunderstandings, from long conversations that left him feeling slightly off balance. There was always the assumption that tomorrow would reset everything, that whatever was drained today would somehow come back. But now, in his 60s, that assumption no longer held true. He could feel the difference in a very real, very physical way, how certain interactions lingered longer, how certain dynamics stayed with him hours after they ended, quietly pulling at his focus, his mood, and his sense of clarity. What once felt manageable now felt costly, not in a dramatic sense, but in a steady, undeniable way that made him more selective with every passing month. He started noticing how much lighter he felt on days when he did not have to explain himself, did not have to adjust his tone, did not have to anticipate someone else's reaction before speaking honestly. That contrast became impossible to ignore because it revealed something simple but powerful. That peace was not just the absence of conflict, it was the absence of internal restriction. And once he experienced that kind of peace, even briefly, the idea of returning to any environment that required him to filter, suppress, or reshape his emotional reality began to feel less like compromise and more like a step backward into something he had already outgrown. At first, Robert wanted to believe that the issue was specific, that it was about certain moments, certain conversations, or even certain phases that would eventually pass if he handled them better. It felt easier to think that way, because it meant the problem had a solution he could control. But the more honest he became with himself, the more he realized that it was not about a single situation or even about Susan Miller as a person. She was not cruel, she was not intentionally difficult, and she was not trying to take anything from him. In many ways, she was simply being who she had always been. The real shift happened when Robert stopped looking at individual moments and started seeing the pattern underneath them. He began to understand that the tension he felt was not caused by isolated disagreements, but by a deeper mismatch between who he had become and what the relationship quietly required him to be. For years, he had accepted the idea that maintaining connection meant constant adjustment, that being a good partner meant managing not only his own emotions, but also the emotional atmosphere around him. But now, that belief no longer felt true. It felt outdated, like a rule he had followed for decades without ever questioning whether it served him. And once that realization settled in, something unexpected happened. The responsibility he had always carried to make everything work started to loosen its grip, because for the first time, he could see that the cost of maintaining that role had been far greater than he ever allowed himself to admit. What changed for Robert was not just what he saw in the relationship, but what he finally allowed himself to do about it. For most of his life, he operated under a quiet set of rules that he never consciously agreed to but followed anyway. Be dependable, be patient, do not make things harder than they need to be, and above all, do not prioritize your own emotional comfort over the stability of the relationship. Those rules shaped how he responded to conflict, how he expressed himself, and more importantly, how much of himself he kept hidden to avoid disruption. But somewhere in his 60s, that internal agreement began to break down. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment where everything changed, but rather a gradual shift where he started giving himself permission to stop performing. Permission to not immediately fix every tension. Permission to let silence exist without rushing to fill it. Permission to feel something without editing it before it reached the surface. And that permission, simple as it sounds, changed everything. Because once a man realizes that he is allowed to exist without constantly managing the emotional expectations around him, he begins to see just how much of his life was spent doing exactly that. Robert was not becoming distant or detached. He was becoming honest in a way he had never fully allowed before. And with that honesty came a quiet but undeniable realization that any connection requiring him to go back to that old version of himself was no longer something he could step into without feeling like he was giving something essential away again. There was a moment, quiet and almost unremarkable on the surface, when Robert noticed something that would have once terrified him but now felt strangely reassuring. He was sitting alone in his living room on a Sunday morning. No noise, no conversation, no need to check in with anyone or explain what he was doing. And instead of feeling the familiar pressure to fill that space, he felt something else entirely: relief. Not the loud kind, not the kind you celebrate, but a steady, grounded sense that nothing was pulling at him. Nothing was waiting for him to respond in a certain way. Nothing was asking him to adjust himself to keep things balanced. And in that silence, he realized something that changed how he saw everything that came before. For most of his life, he had associated being alone with something missing, something lacking, something that needed to be fixed as quickly as possible. But now he could feel that this was not absence. It was presence, his own presence, uninterrupted and intact. The contrast became impossible to ignore because the peace he felt in that moment was deeper than anything he had experienced inside relationships that required constant emotional management. It was not excitement. It was not intensity. It was something far more valuable at this stage of life: stability within himself. And once a man experiences that kind of internal steadiness, the idea of giving it up, even for connection, begins to feel less like a reasonable trade and more like a loss he is no longer willing to accept. At this point, Robert no longer saw emotional freedom as an abstract idea or a luxury reserved for a different kind of life. He saw it as the foundation of everything that still mattered to him. It was not about avoiding people, and it was not about rejecting connection. It was about no longer participating in anything that required him to disconnect from himself in order to maintain it. For the first time, he could clearly define what he had been missing all those years. Not more attention, not more validation, but the simple ability to exist in a relationship without constantly monitoring, adjusting, and second-guessing his own emotional reality. Emotional freedom, as he now understood it, meant being able to speak without rehearsing, to feel without apologizing, and to step back without being made to feel guilty for it. It meant that silence was not a problem to solve, and honesty was not a risk to manage. And once that definition became clear, it reshaped how he viewed every potential connection moving forward. He was no longer asking whether something could work. He was asking whether it allowed him to remain fully present as himself. That shift was subtle but absolute, because it removed the old criteria he had relied on for decades and replaced it with something far more personal and non-negotiable. And in doing so, it revealed a truth that most people misunderstand: that what he was protecting was not distance from others, but alignment within himself, something he had spent most of his life unknowingly giving away piece by piece. And in the end, what Robert came to understand was not something dramatic or complicated. It was something quiet, almost simple, but impossible to ignore once seen clearly. He was not walking away from connection, and he was not closing himself off from the possibility of being close to someone again. What he was leaving behind was the version of himself that believed love required constant adjustment, constant restraint, and constant negotiation with his own inner world. That version of him had carried relationships for years, had held things together when they felt fragile, had chosen endurance over honesty more times than he could count. But now, that approach no longer felt like strength. It felt like a cost he had already paid in full. At this stage of his life, the question was no longer whether something could be maintained, but whether it could exist without asking him to compromise the one thing he had finally reclaimed: his ability to be fully present as himself. And that clarity changed the way he moved forward in every direction, because it removed the pressure to prove, to perform, or to preserve something that did not naturally support who he had become. If something aligned with that, he was open to it. If it did not, he no longer felt the need to make it work. Not out of bitterness, not out of fear, but out of a level of self-respect that only comes from living long enough to understand what truly matters and having the courage to finally protect it without hesitation.